Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. Today is Tuesday, May 27th, 2025. Today is day 599. We're approaching 600 days since the atrocities by Hamas on October 7th and the atrocities that have followed almost every day since. As violence between Russia and Ukraine seems to be intensifying, President Trump on Sunday criticized the Russian President Vladimir Putin for Moscow's intensifying attacks on Ukraine. You're probably wondering, why in the world is she starting by talking about Ukraine? This is supposed to be an update on the Middle East. But I think it's important to note President Trump said that he was not happy about the recent escalation and later writings that Putin had gone absolutely crazy. Trump wrote that on his social media posts. And the Kremlin yesterday said that Trump's criticism of Putin may be due to an emotional overload. And they thanked the United States and President Trump for their, quote, assistance in organizing and launching this negotiation process, end quote. Why in the world am I starting with this update and with this news? Because President Trump ran on the ticket of one who was going to make peace, a president who would bring peace. And here we are, we're seeing intensifying attacks on Ukraine and things seemingly running amok with President Putin. And of course, Russia is actually very invested in the Middle East. They have quite significant interests, not just metaphorically, but actually physical resources in the Middle East, including weapons stores and at least one base. I think there are actually several left in Syria. But Russia's investment is not insignificant, to say the least. So chaos is not only ensuing in Ukraine, but in Gaza as well. As if it were not already, there are increasing reports of deterioration. Initially, I saw on social media in the last 24 hours that we heard this in relationship to the distribution of aid, that centers for this new Israeli-U.S. plan, is it Israeli plan? Is it a U.S. plan? Who knows? But that we heard this new plan, these centers were being opened. And Amichai Stein wrote on Twitter or X that this is a huge development, taking from Hamas the ability to control the citizens in Gaza. There were pictures posted that said in the past hour, 2 initial distribution centers for humanitarian aid were opened in Rafah, in South Gaza. And then very quickly, there were additional reports that at one of the centers, the American company personnel failed to control the people and they retreated to one of their positions, after which they began to hear helicopters in the air, including reports of gunfire. Now, these administrators are supposed to be former military, they're supposed to have expertise, etc. There are people starving, and this is the first time food is being allowed in the enclave in weeks and weeks and weeks. And if anything but unrest is expected, well, that would be foolish. But of course, there would be the expectation of that. And yet already just in day one at one of the centers, there seemed to be a lack of control. Now, we heard yesterday, and I'll just repeat this, that Jake Wood, the chief executive of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, GHF, resigned, saying that it's, quote, not possible to implement the Israeli-backed plan, quote, while also strictly adhering to the humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence, end quote. So speaking of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, they named John Acri as the interim executive director following Wood's resignation. And the executive director at the UN World Food Program, the current executive director, Cindy McCain, on Sunday called the food situation in Gaza a catastrophe, saying that 500,000 people inside of Gaza are extremely food insecure. The WFP, World Food Program, Friday said that 15 of their trucks were looted in Gaza in the last week, an incident that the agency said underlined the insecurity connected to, quote, hunger, desperation, and anxiety over whether or not food would be coming. So that is a report specific to the UN World Food Program. The GHF, again, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which was supposed to be a U.S. agency, but now there's questions about where the money's coming from. The GHF announced yesterday it had opened the first distribution hubs. This is what I was saying about Twitter, of its new aid distribution system. So in the last week, aid distribution was by the former mechanisms, the UN and aid agencies that existed before. And now there's this new aid distribution system that's begun delivering food very, very, very slowly, but we're grateful that it's been begun delivering food to Palestinians. The foundation did not specify the location of the hubs or the amount of food distributed. It remains unclear who's funding the project. That's the Associated Press saying that. Israelis say it was first proposed by Israeli officials in the earliest weeks of the war. And so there are huge, huge questions about what's happening and who's funding it and whether or not, the actions are in good faith and whether or not they're still being limited. You'll recall the press release that Churches for Middle East Peace put out last week that was highlighting the words of Israeli human rights organizations that were saying that Israel is just saying that they will allow food into Gaza, but food has not actually been allowed in. It's not getting to the people yet. And so these are just some of the updates in that regard. Swiss authorities on Sunday said that they were exploring whether to open a legal investigation into GHF activities. That's how questionable this is about conflict of interest and military actors and private sources and who's funding it. Trial International, a Swiss NGO, last week submitted a request for a probe into whether GHF's aid plan complies with Swiss law and international humanitarian law. And of course, we'd also heard reports that the very devout Christian leader, David Beasley, a Nobel Prize laureate, former executive director of the UN World Food Program, whether or not he was going to be involved in GHF. We haven't heard any updates about his involvement in recent weeks. I did find a little bit of news that notably he has been nominated for the foundation's advisory board, but his appointment has not yet been confirmed. And according to Public Broadcasting Service PBS Today, about an hour ago, close to midnight here in Switzerland, news indicated that it's unclear who will now run GHF. A proposal circulated by the group earlier this month and obtained by AP included several names, including the former director, UN World Food Program, David Beasley. Neither Beasley nor GHF have confirmed his involvement. It's unclear about the funding. It claims to have GHF more than $100 million in commitments from a European Union government, but the donor has not been named. And the US and Israel are saying they are not funding it. A few other significant, just summary pieces of news coming off of Memorial Day weekend. A Palestinian official yesterday claimed that Hamas agreed to U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff's proposal for a Gaza ceasefire. Now, we heard last week that Hamas had agreed to a ceasefire. Witkoff said that the proposal being discussed was not the same as his and was completely unacceptable. An Israeli official likewise denied the proposal was Washington's and said that no Israeli government could accept it. Then we talked also about this yesterday. There was an Israeli airstrike, a catastrophe on a school turned shelter and other targets in Gaza. At least 25 people were killed yesterday. Israeli strikes killed at least 30 across Gaza on Sunday, including a senior rescue service official, a journalist, 2 International Committee of the Red Cross staff members, according to local health authorities and the ICRC. I saw a video on social media of a girl running through a flamed building that was supposedly the school of that school turned shelter. And it looked like a horror film. The Israeli military, according to AP News, is, quote, systematically, end quote, using Palestinians as human shields in Gaza, despite the practice being prohibited under Israeli and international law. This is according to former detainees, Palestinian, and also Israeli soldiers. The Israeli military says it strictly prohibits using civilians as shields or otherwise coercing them to participate in operations. We've heard stories after story of Palestinians being forced to dress as IDF officers and going ahead into tunnels. That's an example of being used as a human shield. Israel claims to control 75% of Gaza within 2 months and to push Palestinian civilians into just a quarter of the territory. This is their aim. Israel aims to control 3/4 quarters, 75% of the Gaza Strip within the next 2 months, and for all of the 2 million Palestinians to be living in 25% of the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip is 26 miles long, if that. 26 miles long, and 2 million people living in a quarter of that territory is the goal, according to the Israeli military on Sunday. Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, she's the security secretary. She met with officials in Israel yesterday and also on Sunday. According to Netanyahu's office, Noem spoke in a meeting on Sunday about her unwavering support for the prime minister in the state of Israel, her great appreciation she expressed towards Netanyahu's conduct of war. She might be the only person, I was going to say, in the world. Netanyahu is not popular. He's not popular in Israel. I mean, there were the largest protests in Israel's history before October of 2023, and Netanyahu is not popular today, just to be clear, in Israel. But separately, Trump on Sunday said he wants to end the war in Gaza, quote, as quickly as possible. And may it be so. If President Trump can have influence and he has the power to do so, may it be so. We know that one of the reasons that Kristi Noem, the secretary, was in Israel was to attend the services on behalf of the 2 Israeli embassy staff workers who were murdered in Washington, D.C. last week. And the foreign ministry in Israel hosted memorial service for those embassy workers killed in that D.C. shooting. Yaron Lazinski and Sarah Milgram. The event was hosted by the Foreign Minister Gideon Saar, and it was attended by the U.S. Homeland Security Chief Kristi Noem and the U.S. Ambassador to Israel Mike Huckabee. In Israel, some international news summarized what I talked about on the Flag Day March. It's called the Dance of the Flags, a notable celebration that marks the holiday. It's a flag flying parade known as the Dance of the Flags. The chief rabbinate in Israel declared Jerusalem Day to be a minor religious holiday. It marks the regaining for the Jewish people of access to the Western Wall after the taking of East Jerusalem from the Jordanians in the Six-Day War. That was in 1967. So Flag Day celebrations this week included crowds of far-right Israelis chanting insults and assaulted Palestinians. This just happened yesterday during the annual Jerusalem Day parade commemorating Israeli forces taking the Palestinian majority East Jerusalem during 1967. A summary in terms of attacks from January 2024 to March of 2025, 14 Israelis were killed by Palestinians from the West Bank in attacks over the last year plus. That also resulted in the killing of 6 Palestinians. That's between January 2024 and March 2025. OSHA issued a report on their West Bank monthly snapshot. And in this month alone, in the occupied West Bank, 16 Palestinians were killed and 351 Palestinians were injured in the West Bank. There were 122 attacks this month, April alone. 378 Palestinians displaced. There were 0 fatalities. This is in the West Bank, and 4 Israeli injuries. The numbers between January and April, January 2024 and April 2025 over the last year are 616 Palestinian fatalities in the West Bank, of which 115 of those are children. 115 children killed over the last year plus in the occupied West Bank. 4,512 Palestinian injuries, of which 904 were children. These are numbers from OSHA, the UN agency. There were close to 2,000 attacks, 1,936 attacks by Israeli settlers during that same time period. And the total amount of Palestinians displaced in the West Bank since January of 2024 is 41,272. There were 29 Israeli fatalities, 29 fatalities, Israeli fatalities, 3 children and 17 members of the Israeli forces, 29 and 616 Palestinian deaths, 160 Israeli injuries during that time period. I'm sharing this news to say that conflict and war and violence is not good for anyone. And this is not a false equivocation, but there is so much suffering and trauma, which begets more suffering and trauma. In terms of incidents of settler attacks, I mentioned there were close to 2,000. OSHA had a very profound map showing where those were all over the West Bank. Shifting to Lebanon, they began to disarm the armed Palestinian factions and refugee camps on Lebanese territory, leading into June. A spokesperson for the Prime Minister of Lebanon said on Friday, disarming factions would serve as a trial run before attempting to disarm Hezbollah, experts say. We discussed this. This was a significant agenda topic during the visit of the Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas, when he was recently in Lebanon. Just a couple of other updates. Iran is open to compromises and nuclear talks with Washington, but uranium enrichment remains non-negotiable, according to Tehran's foreign minister. The Trump administration on Friday lifted several major sanctions on Syria. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said, this is the first step in the promise that President Trump made to help stabilize Damascus's new government. Separately, the U.S. ambassador to Turkey, Tom Barak, on Friday said he'd assumed the role of special envoy to Syria. The newly appointed, and very untraditional in this, the newly appointed National Security Advisor, guess who it is? Marco Rubio. The Secretary of State is also the National Security Advisor. He on Friday dismissed scores of staff at the White House, including the National Security Council staff person, the role related to the Middle East, Eric Traeger on the National Security Council. Eric Traeger was put on administrative leave. The White House also said that Andy Baker, a policy advisor to Trump, who had been serving under J.D. Vance, is now moving into Deputy National Security Advisor roles alongside of Robert Gabriel, who was a policy advisor to Trump. He's also a Deputy National Security Advisor. Finally, I had the privilege today of leading a panel on interfaith engagement here in Bern, Switzerland, at the Freedom of Religion Conference and the Preservation of Armenian Religious, Cultural, and Historical Heritage of Nagorno-Karabakh, Artsakh. And if you haven't taken a look at the 3-part mini course that we did, I think it was 2 years ago, maybe it was longer, on Armenia, it's still incredibly relevant. And I'm feeling inspired to do another one come this fall. Armenia is the oldest Christian nation in the world, and the experience, displacement, genocide of the Armenian people, the neglect of the Armenian experience, their cultural heritage, which continues to be ethnically cleansed, the incredible triumphs of the Armenian people is something that we can all learn from. Interestingly, the Armenian story seems to be an intersection in ways of Jewish experience and Palestinian narrative, perhaps come together or intersect. The oppression of the Armenian Christian quarter in the Old City of Jerusalem, we've talked about a lot. And at the conclusion of his Ober-Salzburg speech on August 22nd, 1939, Adolf Hitler, a week before he invaded Poland, said this. He said, "Who, after all, speaks of the annihilation of the Armenians? May we not forget the genocide of the Armenians. Hitler used it as a justification in the annihilation of the Jews." I just was speaking to someone from Northern Europe, from Latvia today, who was talking about the Russian annihilation during World War II that most of the Western world doesn't even talk about. And so some of the key themes we talked about today on this interfaith panel that I led were so incredibly powerful. Muslim Azza Karam, former head of the Religions for Peace and founder of Lead Integrity, the first women's focused global consulting agency, Rabbi Alex Goldberg of the UK. Dr. Karam talked about how when any of us suffer, we all suffer, which made me think of the verses in scripture from 1 Corinthians 12, when any part of the body, when any part of humanity created in God's image suffers, we all suffer. And if we don't, let us look at our hearts. And Rabbi Goldberg, who was taught and mentored by the former chief rabbi of the UK, Jonathan Sachs, considered by many to be one of the foremost leaders on interfaith engagement and peace building. Rabbi Goldberg talked about how we must plant seeds of peace so that our children and our grandchildren can live under the shade of the trees of the seeds that we have planted, even when we disagree. Now, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs used to say, "Can I make space for difference, for people who disagree?" And there's this space for dialogue, but what we talked about today is dialogue not getting in the way of action. And I think that many Palestinians and Jewish people around the world would say, yes, I can make space for difference as long as your difference doesn't kill me. or take my land, or oppress me, or dispossess me, or occupy me, or take me hostage, or oppress me in the midst of our differences. Which led me back to the Mother Teresa quote that I first learned from Lynn Hybels at Christ at the Checkpoint in 2010. I worked with her at Willow Creek way back in the day. Lynn quoted Mother Teresa in saying, "The reason we do not have peace is that we have forgotten that we belong to one another." And I fundamentally believe that to be true. We are made in the image of God. We mourn with those who mourn. May we mourn with those who mourn, whoever they may be, advocating for human rights, equality, self-determination, and an end to all violence. Be it the military prowess of Israel, an end to all violence. Be it the attacks of Hamas and militants, the end of all violence. Be it the blockading of the Palestinian people, which is suffocating them from food and water and their basic needs, an end to all violence. Work towards a new reality and a better future for our children and for our neighbors' children and their grandchildren, and maybe even for our enemies' children and our enemies' grandchildren. May we do so inspired by love and justice. And for those of us who are Christians and follow Christ, in the name of the Prince of Peace, Jesus, may we continue to pursue peace. Amen.